Welcome to Ghostlore Chronicles. Here, we uncover dark secrets, urban legends, and tales of the supernatural. Tonight, we take you on a chilling journey into the mystery of the black-eyed children, where terror hides in shadows, and every knock may be an invitation to something unholy. Turn off the lights, sit back, and listen carefully, because fear is already whispering in your ear. My name is Daniel, and I've lived in Chicago most of my life. I've always loved this city. The glowing skyline at night, the constant hum of traffic, the way life never really stops, not even at 3 in the morning. But I never imagined that hidden within the alleys, abandoned buildings, and forgotten corners, there were things so dark that even the bravest cop or the most hardened night worker wouldn't dare to speak of them. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of one long, harrowing year. I used to think urban legends were nothing more than creepy stories told to scare kids. Bloody Mary, the vanishing hitchhiker, the black-eyed children. All of it seemed like harmless campfire nonsense, until I started to see pieces of those legends bleeding into real life. It began on an ordinary evening. I had just finished a late shift at the bar where I worked. Walking home, I cut through Lower Wacker Drive, a place that always gave me the creeps. Down there, under the city, it feels like another world entirely. The lights buzz weakly, rats scurry in the shadows, and every sound echoes as though someone is following you. That night, it wasn't just the sound of my own footsteps. I heard a second set. Slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was some drunk staggering behind me. But when I turned, there was no one. Just empty concrete, stretching into the dark. I tried to shake it off, but then I caught a glimpse of movement in one of the service tunnels, like a shadow peeling itself off the wall. I froze. The figure didn't walk. It just shifted closer, as if the darkness itself was sliding toward me. My chest tightened, and without thinking, I bolted. When I reached the surface, the night air felt thin, almost poisonous. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But that was only the beginning. 2 nights later, something stranger happened. I was at the bar again, cleaning up after closing, when a man came in through the side door. I didn't recognize him. His clothes were outdated, like he had stepped straight out of the 70s. Bell-bottom jeans, a leather jacket, hair slicked back. He sat at the bar without ordering, his face hidden beneath the dim light. Rough night, I asked him, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer at first. Then he turned his head, and I nearly dropped the glass in my hand. His eyes, they weren't normal. They were completely black, like 2 pools of ink. I stammered something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse to leave, but he leaned forward and said in a low, flat voice, "They're watching you, Daniel." My name. He knew my name. I blinked, and in that split second he was gone. Just gone. No sound of footsteps, no door opening, nothing. The bar was empty. From that night on, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him sitting at the bar, those black eyes drilling into me. I started asking around, quietly at first. Other bartenders, night shift workers, homeless people who camped under bridges. And I kept hearing whispers about figures with dark eyes, about children knocking on doors in the middle of the night, asking to be let in. One homeless man, named Arthur, told me he had seen them too. We were sitting by the river when he leaned close and said, "They don't come out in daylight, only when it's quiet. They pretend to be people, but they're not. If you talk to them, if you let them in, you won't come back the same." His voice cracked on that last sentence. I wanted to believe Arthur was just another drunk telling stories. But then came the night I heard the knock. It was 3 in the morning. I was half asleep when a slow, steady tapping echoed through my apartment. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. My stomach dropped. No one visits at that hour. I went to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. 2 kids. A boy and a girl. They couldn't have been older than 12. They stood perfectly still, their faces pale in the hallway light. The boy said, "Please let us in. Our parents will be here soon." His voice was flat, rehearsed, almost robotic. My hand froze on the doorknob. Something in me screamed not to open it. The girl slowly lifted her head, and that's when I saw them. Black eyes. Bottomless, soulless black eyes. I stumbled back, heart racing, whispering to myself, "Don't open the door. Don't open it." They knocked again, louder this time. "Please," the boy said. "We can't come in unless you let us." That line chilled me to the bone. Unless you let us. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but when I looked back through the peephole, they were gone. Just an empty hallway. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, but the dents on my door told me otherwise. Things escalated quickly after that. I started hearing voices on the train. People whispering my name when no one was around. My reflection in the windows would lag just a fraction of a second behind me. And every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of those children. Always watching, always waiting. I decided to start documenting everything. If no one believed me, at least I'd have a record. I carried a small recorder, interviewing anyone who claimed they'd seen something strange. And the stories I collected were more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. A security guard downtown told me about a woman who appeared on the cameras every night at exactly 2:15 a.m., standing in the stairwell, staring directly into the lens. But when he checked in person, the stairwell was empty. A rideshare driver swore he had picked up a passenger who vanished from the back seat before reaching the destination. All that remained was a smear of black liquid on the seat. And then there was the story of the old hospital on the west side. Abandoned for decades, but locals swore that at night, the windows lit up, and you could hear children laughing inside. Piece by piece, the legends were connecting. The black-eyed man, the children, the shadows under the city, they weren't separate stories. They were threads of the same nightmare, woven into the fabric of Chicago itself. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. People I interviewed would sometimes disappear days later. One woman, a nurse who had worked in that abandoned hospital, told me she'd share her story, but only if we met in person, away from cameras and phones. We met at a small diner on the edge of town. She was pale, trembling, clutching her coffee like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She told me about the night shift she'd worked 15 years ago, the night the hospital was suddenly evacuated without explanation. "There was a blackout," she whispered. "Emergency generators kicked in, but the halls were wrong. Too long. Too dark. We heard children laughing, dozens of them, but the pediatric wing had been closed for years. When we checked, the rooms were full of shadows. They weren't empty, Daniel. They were moving." Her hands shook violently as she spoke. She said the hospital closed the next day, officially due to budget cuts. But she swore it was because the staff refused to go back inside. When I asked her if she had seen the children since then, her eyes welled with tears. She only said, "They never leave you. Once you've seen them, they follow." By the time I walked out of that diner, the city no longer felt like home. Every streetlight flicker, every child's laughter in the distance, every shadow that lingered too long, it all felt like a warning. And deep down, I knew I was in too far. After that night at the diner, I couldn't stop thinking about what the nurse had said. Her words echoed in my mind, "Once you've seen them, they follow." It explained the footsteps I heard when I was alone, the reflections that didn't quite match me, the strange static voices that slipped into my dreams. I wasn't just observing some urban legend anymore. I had become part of it. I started recording everything. My phone was filled with voice memos, my shaky breathing after seeing a figure at the end of the street, the faint knocking on my walls, the sound of children laughing faintly through my vents even though I lived on the top floor of a sealed apartment building. Sometimes I'd play the recordings back, and there would be voices I didn't hear in the moment. A whisper here, a chuckle there. Once, a soft voice sang my name, stretched long and drawn out, like it wanted me to answer. Friends started noticing how paranoid I'd become. I stopped going out at night. I installed new locks, sealed my windows, even covered mirrors in my apartment. But none of it helped. The more I tried to block them out, the stronger their presence grew. One evening, while reviewing one of my recordings, I caught something I couldn't ignore. The audio had picked up a conversation in the background. A man's voice and a child's voice. "Not yet," the man said. "Soon?" the child asked. "Yes, when he lets us." I dropped the phone. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely pick it up again. They were talking about me. I knew I couldn't do this alone anymore. If I was going to survive, I needed to find people who had experienced the same thing and lived to tell about it. I found an online forum dedicated to paranormal encounters. Most of it seemed like nonsense. Blurry photos, campfire tales recycled from the internet, but buried deep in the threads, I found a username that kept appearing, Watcher76. Watcher76 posted detailed accounts of encounters with black-eyed figures, stories that mirrored mine almost exactly. He described the knocking, the children, even the man with black eyes who appeared in crowded places but left no trace. I reached out to him, desperate for answers. To my surprise, he agreed to meet. We chose a quiet spot by the lake, far from the city noise. He turned out to be an older man, late 50s, with a gaunt face and haunted eyes. The first thing he said when he sat down beside me was, "You shouldn't have looked for me. They'll know now." I told him everything, the bar, the children at my door, the nurse at the diner. He listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, as though every detail confirmed something he already knew. When I finally finished, he leaned forward and whispered, "They're not children. They're not even human. They're shadows wearing skin. They've been here longer than the city itself." I asked him what they wanted. His answer sent a chill through me. They want to be invited in. That's the only way they can cross over fully. Doors, windows, your mind, it doesn't matter. They need permission. Once you give it, you're theirs. I asked him how he knew so much, and he rolled up his sleeve. His forearm was covered in burn marks, shaped like small handprints. "They tried to take me years ago," he said. "I never let them in. But I've been paying the price ever since." Before I could respond, he stood up suddenly, scanning the shoreline. His body stiffened. "We're not alone," he hissed. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. A group of children stood 100 feet away, half hidden in the mist rising from the lake. They weren't moving. They were just watching. Their silhouettes were unnaturally still, like cardboard cutouts planted in the ground. When I blinked, they were closer. "We have to go," Watcher76 whispered, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron. "Never answer them. Never let them speak too long." We sprinted back to the city streets, but even as we ran, I could hear them following, soft footsteps, laughter carried on the wind. When we finally reached the safety of a crowded intersection, the sounds stopped. The children were gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line. Meeting him had confirmed the worst, that this wasn't just in my head. They were real, and they were tightening their grip on me. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and nervous glances over my shoulder. I stopped working. My life narrowed down to survival. I checked my locks obsessively, listened to my recordings until the voices made me sick, and kept the lights on at all times. But the encounters kept escalating. One morning, I woke to find muddy footprints leading from my apartment door to my bed. Small footprints, child-sized. My front door was still locked. Another night, I caught a reflection in my bathroom mirror that wasn't mine. A pale child stood behind me, black eyes staring. When I turned around, the room was empty. I knew I couldn't last like this. I called Watcher76 again, begging for help. He told me there was one place left to look, one place where he believed the truth was buried, the abandoned hospital on the west side. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but he insisted. "If you don't face them, you'll never be free." So I agreed, and that decision would change everything. The night we chose to go to the hospital, the sky hung heavy with clouds, smothering even the glow of the city lights. The building loomed ahead like a tomb, its broken windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Rusted metal fences leaned inward as if trying to warn us away. Every story I had ever collected about this place pulsed in my mind. Children's laughter, shadowy figures, patients who never left. Watcher 76 met me at the corner of the street, his face pale under the dim glow of a street lamp. He handed me a flashlight and a small, worn-out tape recorder. "Keep it running," he said. "Sometimes they don't show themselves to the eye, but they'll speak through recordings." I didn't argue. My hands were already shaking too badly to say much. Together, we slipped through a gap in the fence and crossed into the overgrown courtyard. The moment my feet touched the cracked pavement, I felt it. A pressure, like 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down on me. The hospital's front doors hung half open, one of them scraping slowly in the wind with a groan that echoed down the empty block. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of rot. The beam of my flashlight cut through long corridors lined with peeling paint and rusted gurneys. Every step seemed to stir the silence like we were waking something that had been sleeping. We passed the old reception desk, papers scattered across the floor like brittle leaves. The walls were covered in graffiti, but beneath it, I could still see faded murals of smiling children. Their painted eyes followed me no matter where I stood. "Pediatric wings this way," Watcher 76 muttered, his voice low, almost reverent. He moved with the confidence of someone who had been here before, though his shoulders were tense, his every glance sharp and quick. The deeper we went, the colder it grew. My breath fogged the beam of my flashlight, and the shadows seemed to bend around us. I started the recorder, its faint click sounding impossibly loud in the silence. Then we heard it, a child's laugh. It came from somewhere ahead, high-pitched, echoing down the hall. My stomach twisted. Watcher 76 froze, his knuckles white on the flashlight. "Don't answer," he whispered. We crept forward. The sound grew louder, joined by another laugh, then another, until the hallway rang with the playfulness of unseen children. But it wasn't joyful. It was mocking, hollow, as though the walls themselves were jeering at us. When we reached the pediatric ward, the door was sealed shut with a rusted chain. Watcher 76 pulled a crowbar from his bag and forced it open with a metallic shriek. The smell hit me first. Mildew, rust, and something sweet, almost sickening. Inside, rows of tiny beds lined the walls, each one covered in dust. Some had small toys still lying on the sheets. A headless doll, a cracked plastic truck, a teddy bear missing an eye. My flashlight flickered, and I felt something move past me, brushing my arm with a coldness that went straight through to the bone. "Keep recording," Watcher 76 hissed. I lifted the recorder, heart pounding. "Is someone here?" I whispered before I could stop myself. Silence. Then, through the static, a voice. Not through the air, but through the recorder. A child's voice, faint, broken. "We're waiting." The words nearly made me drop the device. Watcher 76 grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the far wall. "They'll try to talk to you. Don't listen. Don't answer." But I had already answered. We pressed deeper into the ward. The murals here were different. Less friendly, more grotesque. Painted smiles stretched too wide. The eyes were blackened, as if someone had burned holes into the walls. My flashlight swept across the far corner, and my breath caught. A child stood there. She was small, no more than 8 years old, wearing a faded hospital gown that trailed against the floor. Her skin was pale as paper, her hair tangled, but it was her eyes, solid black, endless, that locked me in place. "Please," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "We can't leave unless you let us." The same words the children at my door had spoken. Watcher 76 shoved me back. "Don't look at her," he barked, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, pinned by her gaze. She took a step forward, then another, her bare feet silent on the cracked tiles. My flashlight flickered violently. For an instant, she vanished, then appeared again closer, only a few feet away. My chest tightened, couldn't breathe. Suddenly, Watcher 76 yanked me toward the hallway. We stumbled into the corridor just as the sound of dozens of tiny footsteps erupted behind us. The children were running, chasing, their laughter filling every corner of the building. We ran blindly, turning corners, pushing through collapsed doorways, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly off the walls. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but the laughter never faded. If anything, it grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right at our heels. We burst into a stairwell, slamming the door behind us. The echo of footsteps followed us down the stairs, but when we reached the basement level, everything went silent. Pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The air was damp, heavy, filled with the smell of mold and rust. Pipes groaned above us. "This is where it started," Watcher 76 whispered. His voice was almost reverent, but there was fear trembling beneath it. "They didn't shut this hospital because of money. They shut it because something was buried here." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but then I heard it. A chorus of whispers, circling us in the dark. Children's voices, rising and falling, too many to count. Some sounded playful, others angry, some just hungry. "Daniel," one voice sang, "let us in." The sound came from everywhere at once. I clutched the recorder, hoping it was capturing every second, even as my own fear nearly drowned me. And then the lights above us flickered on. For just a split second, the basement came alive. Dozens of children stood in the shadows, their faces blank, their eyes black. They lined the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, hanging there like spiders, their heads twisting unnaturally to watch us. The lights snapped off, and we were plunged back into darkness. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned like I had. I stumbled backward, crashing into pipes, searching for an exit. Watcher 76's flashlight swung wildly, catching glimpses of pale faces, sharp smiles, small hands reaching out from the dark. "We have to get out," he shouted, pulling me toward a service tunnel. We bolted through it, the laughter following like a wave. When we finally emerged into the night, gasping for air, the hospital loomed behind us, its windows glowing faintly with unnatural light. "We're not safe," Watcher 76 said, his voice ragged. "Once they see you, once they speak to you, they never let go." And in that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't just gone looking for an urban legend. I had opened a door I could never close. We thought running away would make it stop. Didn't. The city began to feel like a labyrinth designed for them. Routes that folded back on themselves, alleys that led nowhere, reflections that betrayed me. Even daytime offered no safety. A corner of shade, a closed storefront, the hollow of a doorway. Any of those could hide them. I stopped trusting my eyes. I stopped trusting mirrors. Watcher 76 and I separated for a while after the hospital. He claimed he needed to go somewhere farther out, that he had contacts who could help. I didn't ask questions. I holed up in my apartment, trying to piece together what I'd learned into something useful. Patterns, triggers, weaknesses, anything I could use to buy myself time. The recordings were my lifeline. I played them over and over, slowing them down, amplifying the background until tiny breaths and half-words became legible. In one file, beneath the laughter and the static, I heard something else, like paper rustling or a voice flipping through a book. And then, faintly, a single phrase repeated in a cadence that sounded almost like a chant. Asterisk invite. 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 Asterisk. I began to catalog every instance where the phrase appeared. It wasn't always audible, but when it was there, events followed that escalated. Windows breaking, unexplained power outages, neighbors moving out overnight. It was as if the phrase was one of their hooks, words that once said, "Open something just a crack." I tried to find records of the hospital. Old blueprints, staff lists, maintenance logs. Public records were scarce. The paperwork had been shredded or misplaced. But late at night, between the keystrokes and the static of my own fear, I found one name repeated in different places. Dr. Elias Hargrove. He was listed as the head of pediatric psychiatry at the hospital for years before it closed. After that, the trail went cold. No obituary, no address, nothing. It was like his existence had been scrubbed. Then someone else reached out. A message on the forum, anonymous but specific. Asterisk, you're not the first to hear them. Meet me at the laundromat on Halsted at midnight. Bring the recorder. Asterisk. I almost didn't go, but I needed answers. Anything that could explain why they'd latched onto me. So I went. The laundromat smelled of detergent and ozone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A man sat in a corner with a baseball cap pulled low. He looked like every other insomniac in the city. Tired, hollow-eyed. When I approached, he didn't look up for a long beat. Then he did, and his eyes were the worst kind of familiar. Too young for the lines on his face, like someone who'd aged a decade in trauma. "You're brave to come," he said. He had a voice that made me think of cold cement. "Most get frightened off." I set the recorder between us. He introduced himself as Marco. He claimed to have been one of the maintenance staff at the hospital when things went wrong. His hands shook as he talked. He kept rubbing the pad of his thumb as if trying to erase an itch that wouldn't go away. "It wasn't just the kids," Marco said. "Hargrove did experiments. He thought fear could be measured, contained, harnessed. But whatever he opened, it wasn't a thing you could study. Fed. The more fear, the stronger it got. He tried to close it, but closures cost lives." "Why children?" I asked. Marco's laugh was humorless. "Children are porous. Their minds are more available. Easier for something like that to wedge into. Also, folks take less notice when kids wander off. Nobody thinks to check." He told me about a sealed wing in the basement, something like a containment area that Hargrove had created. Paperwork labeled it as Observation Suite 7. Marco swore there were records, but they were gone, burned or shredded. "Hargrove kept a journal," he whispered. "He thought if he wrote down what he saw, it would help. He was wrong. The journal, it talked back." The laundromat's machines hummed on, indifferent to our confessions. I felt colder than the air conditioning could explain. Marco slid an envelope across the folding table. Inside were photocopies, faded images of handwritten notes, and a single photograph. In the photo, a group of children sat on the steps of the hospital, smiling. Their eyes were dark smudges, like charcoal. On the back someone had scrawled a date. 3 days before the hospital closed. "That's when it began," Marco said. "They started appearing in town afterward. Here they're small places at first. People paid them no mind. Then they learned to use the kindness of strangers." "You mean like asking to be let in?" "Yes." Marco tapped the table hard. "That, unless you let us, that's not a plea. It's a condition." My skin crawled. The phrase had felt like an accidental phrase I'd recorded in a grocery store. A word spoken by a stranger on the train. Now it had a purpose. They didn't simply ask for entry. They needed consent to cross whatever boundaries separated them from us. And that consent could be extracted by voice, by trickery, by making the target feel obligated or sympathetic. I left the laundromat more frightened and more determined. If consent was the key, then removing my ability to give it might help. I started carrying out small experiments. When a childlike outline appeared in the distance, I didn't respond. I sealed my doors, covered peepholes, unplugged phones. I sat in crowded places and forced myself not to meet anyone's eyes. The harder I tried never to invite them, the more creative they became. The black-eyed man returned, once, in the flicker of a subway station sign. He stood at the far end of the platform, watching me as if rehearsing a conversation. People streamed past like water, and for a moment I wished for their anonymity, for the press of bodies to hide me. Instead, the man was gone before I could reach him. Only a smear of cold remained in the space he had occupied. Then the nightmares began in earnest. They were different from the waking incidents, denser, more cinematic. In my dreams, I found myself in rooms that didn't exist. Long white corridors lit by two bright fluorescents, doors with locks that glowed like tiny stars. Children sat in rows, chanting, their mouths moving without making sound. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head, scribbling in a ledger. He looked older and younger at once, and the ledger's pages were black, as if written in ink made from night. I awoke from one dream with my throat tight and my palms stained with something dark that flaked like ash. The recorder had captured my moans, and then a whisper. So close to the microphone I could feel the breath. "We are hungry. We will not leave." The city didn't care about my fear, kept turning, bustling, cursing, flourishing. But within my small sphere of life, things were falling apart. My phone died mysteriously in my hand one afternoon. Battery full at noon, dead by 3. My landlord left a note. Neighbors complained of screaming at all hours. A coworker texted to say she couldn't have coffee with me until I sorted out whatever was happening. Panic was not a productive state, but it was honest. I began to prepare as best as I could. Food that didn't need cooking, backup batteries, a list of people who might help in an emergency. I doubled the layers of locks on my door and stuffed wet towels under it as if that would stop more than wind. I painted the peephole black. I sealed mirrors in thick cloth. I spoke aloud to myself, a litany of refusals. "I do not invite you. I do not open the door. I do not hear you." The sense of being watched grew worse. Sometimes I would stand in my living room and count the seconds between the hum of the refrigerator and the distant city sounds, trying to locate the rhythm of their presence. Once, while doing this, I realized the pattern changed with the count, shorter, quicker, like a child's feet on a staircase. I turned slowly, and in the darkened corner by my bookshelf, 2 small faces were reflected in the black glass of my television. They weren't there when I looked directly. Only the reflection held them, as if some law of their being allowed them to exist only as echoes. The day Watcher 76 called again. His voice sounded older, frayed. He said there was a meeting, others who'd been touched. We had to gather. The thing was spreading in ways he couldn't manage alone. If we sought understanding, he said, we'd find it. If we sat and waited, we'd lose more than sleep. I went. When we met, the mix of people was worse than I expected. Mothers who'd lost children, men whose partners had changed into someone else overnight, a priest with ash under his fingernails. Each carried a tally of encounters and a theory for the cause. The room smelled of bad coffee and worse hope. Someone passed around another photocopy, this one a torn page of Hargrove's ledger. Scratched across it, in a child's uneven print, was a line. Asterisk, we asked to come in. He opened the door. Asterisk. That sentence haunted me longer than anything else. It wasn't just their tactics. People had unwittingly become collaborators. Guilt and curiosity, like a double-bladed knife, had cut open a path for them. If we were to fight them, then we had to fix what people had done, to patch holes of consent and ignorance that dotted the city. We planned small things at first. Warn neighbors, post flyers, keep watch. But warnings seemed to feed the fear that fueled the thing. Posters were torn down. People crossed the street to avoid looking at us. It became clear that whatever we faced could twist concern into access, sympathy into invitation. And as we tried to organize, the children learned new ways to speak. So sweet, so precise, calling names, mimicking loss, playing on regrets. They became masters of temptation. They did not merely stand at doors anymore. They whispered through letter slots and pipes, through the thin places of walls. When a neighbor told me she'd opened her door because the voice sounded exactly like her sister's, I thought my lungs would collapse. She cried and refused to sleep alone after that. Her sister's voice had told her to let us rest. The neighbor had obliged. She hadn't realized she was also a bridge. The meetings grew frantic. New faces arrived each week. People dragged in by desperation more than by hope. A woman whose husband had been a kind man but, overnight, began sleeping at odd hours and humming to himself in an unknown language. A teenager whose reflection smiled even when he didn't. A pastor who confessed he'd seen an altar of toys in the pews of his empty church. Each toy arranged like an invocation. We swapped stories like talismans, each tale making the others feel more real and more dangerous. I learned then how quickly normal rituals could mutate into cracks for them to slip through. Lullabies hummed in the wrong key became invitations. A late-night drive past a playground could act as a calling. People who meant well started leaving lights on outside their homes thinking it would help. Instead, the glow made the faces in windows sharper, the shadows more distinct. Our small band of the awake began to compile rules. Rules that felt more like prayers. Do not answer at night. Do not open your door. Do not speak a child's name if you do not intend to speak it to them in daylight. Cover mirrors. Burn the pictures that hurt you. The last rule was the cruelest. Letting go of photographs, of keepsakes, of proof of the life we feared losing. Felt like surrender. But somebody swore it worked. A woman in our group had her late son's photograph on a mantle. After she burned it, the knocking stopped for a week. Whether that was coincidence or a small victory, it bought her breath. We needed a plan that was more than superstition. Hargrove's ledger was the thread that kept coming up. Somewhere in his handwriting might be an answer or at least an explanation. Marco's copies hinted at rituals. Watcher 76 had once seen a page that suggested a reversal procedure, something about naming, binding, and the cost. No one knew what that cost looked like, but every story we had ended in price. Those who tried to bargain with the thing ended up hollowed, like fruit eaten from the inside. One night, after the meeting had thinned and the cafe's lights went dim, Watcher 76 pulled me aside. His face was flushed and urgent. "There's a place Hargrove went after the hospital closed," he said. "A house he kept off the books. He took the journal there. He thought he could bind them. I think he failed, but failures leave traces. He had a map, an old, folded thing with a route across neighborhoods that had shifted names since the 70s. At the map's center was a house that had no record in city archives. No property taxes, no owner, just a location. Watcher 76 wanted to go that night. I didn't want to. Every fiber of me whispered to stay indoors, to recite my litany and wait. But staying had become a slow death. If there was a lead, a scrap, a ledger page that could tell us the mechanism, if there was any chance to reverse what had been done, I would not sit idle and be consumed by whispers. The house sat in a neighborhood where streetlights were few and the lawns had been allowed to reclaim their fences. The porch sagged like the jaw of a sleeping thing. We squeezed through the gate and approached with our torches and our false bravado. A single window was boarded and scored with childish carvings, as though it had been a child's art project that had gone wrong. Circles with excess, oddly neat triangles. A spiral scratched deep into the wood. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and something metallic, like dried blood. The sitting room held furniture that had been shrouded and abandoned in a hurry. Chairs draped in linens, a mantel with a clock stopped at 2:15. We moved with the silence of thieves, following Watcher 76 as he traced a path to a door in the back of the house. The hinges creaked like whispered syllables. What lay beyond was less a room than a shrine. Shelves of notebooks, jars filled with blackened fragments of toys, child-sized clothes folded and labeled. Candles had been burned down to stubs. Soot lined every surface. In the center, on a wooden stand, lay Hargrove's journal. It was heavier than I expected. Its cover was soft with age. The pages inside were dense with cramped handwriting and diagrams that looked like star charts crossed with childlike drawings. As Watcher 76 opened it, the candlelight flared as though welcoming the words back into the world. Hargrove had written in long, fevered loops about thresholds and permission. He'd cataloged moments when children had asked and when adults had acquiesced. He had circled phrases, consent as passage, naming as seal. The ledger answers the ledger. There was a page where he wrote of experiments that tried to deny the children their voices, recordings played backward, lullabies sung off-key, and Hargrove had noted a reduction in activity for weeks. But then, a child had spoken at a funeral, and the entire ward had dissolved in a night. One entry was different from the rest. Instead of fevered script, it was neat and deliberate. Hargrove had listed steps that looked like a ritual. He had circled a final notation in thick, red ink. Asterisk to close, one must name and refuse in equal measure. It takes what is given and returns the taking. Asterisk underneath, in a different hand, a child had written. But he liked to hear the doors open. We read for hours, and with every line the house seemed to breathe around us. The journal described the terrible symmetry of their need, how invitation was a currency they mined, how once enough small mercies had been collected the border thinned. Hargrove had tried to invert the equation, to demand the children name themselves, to force them into self-recognition. They called it naming and binding. When a child was named against its will, its body would crumple like tissue paper. But the ledger warned of consequences. Binding demanded a toll. Hargrove had written of people disappearing, then of shadows nested within the living. We wanted to use his procedures. We wanted to perform something that might, by a thread, push them back. The group debated the mechanics into dawn. Who would speak, who would refuse, what words to say. But the ledger's last pages were a tangled scribble, then a smear like someone had tried to erase their own hand. The last readable line said, "If you force a child to confess, you must give a confession of equal weight." Watcher 76 looked at me then, his eyes frost-etched. "They are not without logic," he murmured. "They trade. They take. They always need to balance the books." It became clear that any attempt at sealing would not be free of cost. For them to be denied, we would have to offer something. Not blood, we thought at first. But the ledger's phrasing was precise. Hargrove used phrases like equivalent exchange and naming debts. The ledger suggested that memory itself could be currency. A named memory given freely could weigh as much as a physical life. I imagined handing over the memory of my mother's laugh, or the face of a lover, small things that made up the whole of a person. The ledger made me understand why so many did not fight. The price was appetite. The city paid in what it loved. We left the house with copies of the most legible pages and the terrible hesitation of people who have seen under the skin of things. For days we argued and prepared and refused to sleep. We gathered the group one more time, this time to attempt a binding on the abandoned block beside the river where the hospital's foundation had been said to scrape the earth's bone. Marco, who had helped us locate the house, would stand watch. The pastor would chant the counterwords. A woman named Elise, who had lost her son and had nothing left to trade, volunteered to speak the naming. When the night came, all of us felt like we were walking into the mouth of a storm. I remember thinking, absurdly, of simple childhood bargains. Trade me your marble, I'll give you my sticker. The ledger had turned those games into geometry with death at the center. We lit candles in a ring and placed photos, trinkets, and notes inside. Each item a memory someone was willing to trade. Hargrove had written that the exchange required intent, deliberate, clear, and communal. We spoke aloud, naming the children who had haunted us, calling them into being so we could refuse them. "We name you, and you are not welcome." The words felt terrible and necessary. Elise began the binding, voice steady but small. She declared names that had been whispered in alleyways and on porches. The air thinned, and the candles flared as if inhaling. The river's wind answered, a distant sound like hundreds of children singing off-key. Then we heard it, a whisper in reply that was not a child's voice but layered, 100 voices trying to sound like one. "You give," it said, cheap and begging. "You open. We live." Elisa's voice trembled and then steadied. She offered the thing she had chosen to give. The memory of her son's first steps, a smell no one else could replicate. She said it aloud, placed the memory into the center like a coin. Around us, others offered pieces of themselves, photographs, lullabies hummed and then shared, a line from a poem that had saved someone once. Each gift felt like bone being picked free. First, it seemed to work. The whispers faltered, then shrank, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The candlelight steadied. For a breath, one clean, bright instant. The children at the edge of our vision blurred and thinned, and the pressure lifted from my chest. But bargains are beasts with teeth. The ledger's final warning played out with a cruelty that felt like laughter. As the air thinned, I realized Elise was smiling in a way she'd not smiled in months. Relief flooding her face. Then a part of her blinked, and the smile froze. A small hollowness gathered in her gaze, a blankness flickering where memory used to sit. She looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "What's wrong?" someone hissed. Elisa's eyes were emptying, quiet as dusk. She had given away the part of her that had loved, and the bargain had taken more than a single thing. She had traded the memory and, in the ledger's arithmetic, paid the rest in a currency we hadn't understood. The small knotted strings of identity that bind a person to themselves. The binding ended that night with the city quiet and us left holding the ash of what we'd been. Some doors had closed. Some curtains had fallen. The children at the window edges receded like fog. The knocks diminished. But the cost was visible in the people around the candle ring. Faces that had softened in places. Empty patches where stories used to live. We had bought an interval. The ledger had confirmed a terrible truth. You could push back, but not without giving. And once you gave, the thing owned a part of you. The week after, the city sighed like a thing relieved but wary. Some neighbors returned to their routines. Some people stopped believing again, comforted by the lull. Watcher 76 told me, with a tired humor, that the ledger had always been a bad manual and a worse map. He said Hargrove had tried to play God and paid. He said we had only delayed the bill. But when I lay awake that night, every song and photograph that had been offered replayed like a wound. I could see the ledger's ink like veins under the skin of the city. The children still came sometimes, less often, in smaller numbers, bided at thresholds not yet sealed. They patted in the corners of my eyes and in the mirrors I had wrapped. Most of all, I learned to measure the quiet not as safety but as a balance. For every memory we burned, every photo we shredded, something in us thinned. The ledger had taught us that fear had substance, and that we could not wage war against it without paying in the only currency it wanted. The things that made us who we were.